Well, we just want to welcome you to this very special series on the culture of life versus the culture of death. And we're right at this ebb now where we can either see a tremendous breakthrough for human life and joy and happiness in the world, or the unbelievable age of barbarism that Holy Father talks about if we don't follow the moral code. We're here with Father Frank Pavone, the founding director of Priests for Life, to guide us through this vital document on Humanae Vitae, on human life by Paul VI. Father, what section do you want to share now?
Well, if we look at section 16, we see the Church talking about the ways in which, without breaking God's law, a couple can say, okay, we need to avoid a child at this point. Because as we've already discussed, first of all, married love comes from God. He has a plan for it. It has to be always open to new life. That doesn't mean it always has to bring forth a new life. And responsible family planning, as we've seen, means that the couple, first of all, has dominion over their own passions and instincts. You know, we are the reason and the will must dominate the passions, but then at the same time, God's law must dominate our reason and will. The Holy Father in section 16 asks a question. He says, if we are saying that human reason and will are to dominate our passions, then doesn't it make sense that we develop means of birth control to adequately plan our families? And this is one of the most common questions or objections that people will have to the Church's no to contraception.
Right.
So then the Pope goes on to answer the question. He says, yes, of course, God wants to use us to use our intelligence. And the Church is the first to praise the initiatives of science and technology that improve the human condition. But he says, in doing so, we always have to do it in accordance with the law of God. And then he says the following: if there are serious motives to space out births, and we acknowledge that certainly there can be, which derive from the physical or psychological conditions of husband and wife, or from external conditions, the Church teaches that it is then licit to take into account the natural rhythms immanent in the generative functions for the use of marriage in the infecund periods only, and in this way to regulate birth without offending the moral principles which have been recalled earlier. Now, the moral principle recalled earlier is that there is a connection willed by God and unable to be broken by us between the unitive and the procreative meaning of the sexual act. Okay, so we can't break it on our own. We can't close the door. But what he's saying here is sometimes God does. And if God does, and he has by building in the rhythms of fertility and non-fertility, well then that's not something that we're doing on our own initiative. We're just recognizing there's a plan of God built in here. And it's perfectly legitimate for the spouses to come together at an infertile time. And it's also perfectly legitimate for them to come together and to deliberately find out when that infertile time will be. There's nothing wrong with us learning and observing and patterning, if you will, the cycle of fertility and non-fertility. That's what so-called natural family planning does. When we talk about natural family planning, I think many people think about the so-called calendar rhythm method, where they would mark off days on a calendar, and essentially they were giving an educated guess about when the fertile days would be.
That's what we had in our day. You know, it was rhythm, right?
And we've come way beyond that. And it's important for people to understand that the Church is laying out here moral principles, not scientific conclusions. In other words, the science available to us at every given time in history will vary. The moral principles will remain the same. So the Church is not here endorsing any particular form of natural family planning. There are many different forms, and again, they will vary as the science progresses. But we have today a whole branch of science called naprotechnology, which stands for Natural Reproductive Technology. And to make a long story short, we can pinpoint the fertile days in the wife's cycle. The spouses together can collaborate in observing those signs, and then in mutually deciding, only when there are grave reasons, that they will make use of their right to sexual intimacy only during the infertile days. Now, knowing which are the fertile days can also be used the other way. You can say, we want to conceive a child
Right,
now.
so you can use the same method to conceive.
Exactly. And that's one of the many things that distinguishes natural family planning from contraception. Because contraception is an absolute no to the life-giving power of the human body. We say no. We close the door on our own authority. Well, we don't have the authority to do that. But with natural family planning, it's not... See, if people think of it as just a method, then they're going to be confused. They're going to say, well, isn't this the same as contraception? All you're doing is you're using time instead of a device or a drug. No, it's very different because it's not primarily a method to avoid having children. It's primarily a lifestyle based on reverence for the plan of God, based on virtue, because obviously this approach requires self-control.
Yes.
I mean, if you have a serious reason to avoid children, well then, what this is saying is you're living a life where for a limited number of days, the two of you respectfully step away from that marriage act. And that doesn't mean you're not showing your love to one another. You find 100,000 other ways to show your love to one another. But
Just
you
being
are
present to one another. I mean, just really being present to one another, really listening to one another is a beautiful way to show your love for one another.
Exactly. And many couples have found, I mean, you've heard them, I've heard them, the testimony of couples who say that when we both took responsibility for our fertility, instead of a device or a pill that puts the burden of controlling fertility on one spouse, sometimes without even the knowledge or consent of the other spouse, this is this natural family planning lifestyle is a balancing now between the two spouses. It demands a mutual knowledge, a mutual collaboration, discussion, conversation, decision making. It strengthens the marriage.
It does. It's a sacrifice. It's a reverence for one another. It's a sacrifice. And these pills are very dangerous now.
That's another... Right.
And these other devices are becoming very dangerous.
You know, perhaps Dr. Chris Kallenborn, he's a physician who for many years has studied the physical side effects, the negative effects of birth control pills. He's written a book this thick about how, for example, one of the risks of these drugs is various types of cancer.
Yeah.
I mean, we're concerned about women's rights and women's health, and anybody who is so concerned about that, and often the pro-contraception people are taking their stand precisely on that platform. We're for women's rights, women's health. Well, have you studied what these drugs do to women's health?
Oh, it's terrible. Yeah.
So it's very important that we keep an open mind about, looking at what the science is saying here.
God's ways, again, the healthiest ways, and to work it through. Well, good Father, well, thank you so much for walking the walk and being so faithful to the church and helping people to understand this vital document. And it's so easy to read.